The 20th century was a time of incredible change. Unspeakable horrors and amazing leaps of scientific discovery. It was a century where we showed what we are truly capable of. The pure imagination of artistic expression. The insidious desire to harm and oppress. The will to fight against the weight of a prevailing status quo. The drive to understand the universe and to improve our lives. A century made by leaders and revolutionaries, scientists and thinkers, artists, icons, heroes, and villains. We will count down through the 101 figures of the 20th century who have shaped the world in which we live, and whose stories form the tapestry of our history. On this episode,
all of a sudden there was a new kind of glamour in American political life.
By triggering the Second World War, he in fact brought global history together.
Some would see him as a philosopher. I see him primarily as a political leader.
I've wrestled with alligators. I've tussled with a whale. I done handcuffed lightning and put thunder in jail. You know I'm bad. I've murdered a rock. I injured a stone. And I hospitalized a brick. I'm so bad I make medicine sick. I can drown a drink of water and kill a dead tree. Wait till you see Muhammad Ali.
Olympic gold medalist and heavyweight champion of the world, Muhammad Ali was a supreme talent in the boxing ring. From the early 1960s until his retirement in 1981, his unique style and showy persona dominated his sport.
The bravado, I think, was really appealing to people. But also I think that what Ali was really great at doing was engaging a narrative of struggle, was engaging the old kind of David versus Goliath myth.
I'm the underdog fighting a hard puncher who's knocking out everybody, and I'll go into this fight and shock the whole world.
Behind the bravado and the entertaining bouts of self-promotion was an athlete who brought a new dynamic energy to boxing. In a world of force-driven heavyweight boxers, Ali was a butterfly.
So I never worry about hitting power. So a man like George that comes out with those big boom, 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 boom. So I don't believe that I'm going to be knocked out and punched around. Experience is why I know I'll win.
He had velocity or speed, playing down brute force that his predecessors had displayed, and that to me is the reason that Muhammad Ali became the legend he was.
After Ali converted to Islam in 1964, he became more vocal on issues outside the ring. In 1967, Ali was drafted to fight in the Vietnam War and refused to serve on religious grounds. He was arrested and stripped of his world title and boxing license.
But if you notice, I'm been the most persecuted. I'm not allowed to work in America. I'm not allowed to leave America. Home of the brave, land of the free.
In the mid-1970s, Ali was able to return to boxing and would fight some of the most memorable matches of his career. In 1974, it was Ali versus undefeated heavyweight champion George Foreman in Zaire, a fight nicknamed the Rumble in the Jungle.
Muhammad Ali's greatest sporting moment was the Rumble in the Jungle because he clearly beat a fighter who was so much better than him, who was bigger, who was stronger, who was more powerful. And the fight then became something more than the fight itself. It seemed to be a symbolic manifestation of everything that Muhammad Ali stood for.
Over the years he was in the ring, Muhammad Ali would prove himself to be one of the greatest sporting figures in the world. Drawing a new audience to boxing, there to see Ali match his talk with incredible action.
I think he read the community that they would understand why should he hold back about saying what he thinks about himself if he thinks he's the greatest? Because he was.
It's just hard to be humble when you're as great as I am.
Yeah, I'm still shocked. Still don't know what to say about it.
The American people have just suffered a great loss. I think this is the worst possible thing that could ever happen to our country at a time like this.
He had raised the hopes of the nation, setting our collective sight to the stars. The youngest man elected president of the United States, and the youngest to die. In 1960, the Democratic candidate for President of the United States was a young senator from Boston. His name was John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy was seen by some as a very exciting new face of American politics. And of course, it wasn't just him, but his wife as well. All of a sudden, there was a new sort of case for sophistication and of glamour in American political life.
Kennedy was going up against Richard Nixon, a two-term vice president for the popular President Eisenhower. But Kennedy offered an appealing alternative, and his telegenic appearance gave him an edge in the campaign's televised debates.
I think that without television, John Kennedy likely would not have been elected president. Certainly the fact that he embodied a kind of energetic, forward-looking, young-feeling sense of America, and that was conveyed mostly through the medium of television, that was, I think, tremendously important to his victory.
Kennedy was inaugurated on January 20, 1961. In his speech, he set the tone for his presidency.
The devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world.
In office, Kennedy's economic program sparked a period of expansion. But perhaps his greatest accomplishment was his role in sending a man to the moon. An idea he first proposed to Congress in 1961.
I think from the point of view of the American spirit and also in terms of a kind of major milestone in human achievement, his advocacy of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade and then the successful carrying out of that goal will be the thing he's likely to be remembered for 100 or 200 years from now.
One of Kennedy's other defining moments came in October 1962. US reconnaissance planes flying over Cuba photographed an installation of Russian nuclear missiles. The ensuing standoff brought the world to the brink of nuclear war.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom.
The end of the Cuban Missile Crisis was owed in part to President Kennedy's steady hand in avoiding escalation. But Kennedy's successes are marred by his failure to avoid increased involvement in the Vietnam War. A war that consumed America throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, a reality that Kennedy himself would not live to see. His assassination in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, created a renewed sense of crisis, shattering the hope his time in office had promised.
Across the country, around the world, disbelief was the first reaction. Then a great outpouring of grief, shock, and revulsion.
As president, John F. Kennedy ushered the country into a new era of forward-thinking idealism, representing the youthful vitality and optimism that epitomized the best of the 1960s. The emotional role he played as a figurehead for his country and the world made the blow of his assassination even more profound. A giant in the art world, the ripples of his work and his influence were felt more widely than any of his contemporaries. With an unparalleled level of creative output, he would become known as the father of modern art. Pablo Picasso had his first art exhibition in Barcelona in 1900. The first step in a career that would span decades and result in one of the most influential bodies of work in modern art.
Pablo Picasso, of course, has been setting contemporary fashion in art for years.
The Picasso art phenomenon is a constantly evolving beast. At the beginning of his career, you start with the blue period, but he leaves this style very quickly and moves on to the rose periods, where you have a very tender image and a very different mood. And this is true throughout Picasso's career. He has an insatiable curiosity for life, and history itself is an evolving machine, and Picasso responds to his period.
There were many sides to Picasso's artistic identity, but one of his most widely known contributions to art is as the co-founder of Cubism, an avant-garde art movement that emerged in Picasso's work in 1909, using his art to pick apart and understand the essence of reality.
I like to think of the analogy of a child being given a watch and being told to draw it. Most children would pick up the watch and draw the face and the hands. Picasso will take the watch apart. He'll get the cogs, he'll get every single part, he'll lay it out, and then he'll show that across the picture plane.
Cubism was profoundly influential on European painting and sculpture, even though the movement itself only lasted around 10 years. Picasso would eventually move on to Surrealism, another immensely important movement in modern art. In his nearly 80-year creative career, Pablo Picasso created 13,500 paintings, 100,000 prints, and 34,000 illustrations. Working in painting and collage, as well as writing poetry and creating sculptures, continuing to create a rich body of work to be explored by future artists.
And of course his art has just influenced generations of people. And because Picasso has such a varied career, artists almost pick and choose from which Picasso means the most to them. He's this enormous person to draw on.
A genius, immortalized through his work, Picasso belonged to the 20th century.
A scientist underappreciated in her time, her meticulous precision and patience would see her make one of the most important discoveries in the history of medical science. By the time Rosalind Franklin was 25 years old, she'd been awarded her PhD and was working in a lab in Paris. Here she learned to use X-ray crystallography and diffraction, a process that involved crystallizing a substance and then shooting X-rays through it onto photographic paper, creating an image that could be used to interpret the molecule's three-dimensional structure. In 1951, Franklin moved to a lab at King's College in London.
Well, Rosalind Franklin arrived at King's College really with very impressive technical capability in terms of X-ray crystallography. And she was somebody throughout her career who demonstrated that, not only was she was a gifted mathematician and very intelligent, but she had what's termed golden hands. I think she could actually get experiments to work. She could do things that other people couldn't do.
At King's College, Franklin and her lab assistant set about studying DNA using X-ray crystallography. They took hundreds of photographs, each requiring up to 100 hours of X-ray exposure to create. One stood out among the rest, known as photograph 51. To some, the photograph looked like a spotted X pattern. To anyone who knew how light diffracts through a coil shape, it was a clear indication of a helix structure. One such person was scientist James Watson. When Franklin's colleague Maurice Wilkins showed him the image, Watson knew exactly what it meant. Watson created the first model for DNA structure with lab partner Francis Crick in 1953. In 1962, Watson, Crick, and Maurice Wilkins were awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine, 4 years after Rosalind Franklin's death at 37 years old. Photograph 51 has been referred to as the most important photo ever taken. A piece of work that was like a Rosetta Stone for DNA modeling, a key to interpreting the research that others had conducted to that point. For many years, Rosalind Franklin's name and her critical role in discovering the structure of DNA were lost to history. But the importance of the field she helped to unlock is well known.
I can't think of really anything that's had a similar impact in the 20th century. The discovery of DNA then allowed us to understand how DNA is replicated and transmitted from generation to generation. Discoveries made through an understanding of DNA are now pivotal in terms of medicine, predicting genetic disease, and in terms of therapy such as gene therapy. So it's just had a truly massive contribution.
One of humanity's finest moments would emerge from the most dangerous period of the 20th century. The attention of the world fixed on a single man as he took a leap into the unknown. (1960). For years, the Soviets and the Americans had been jostling to be the first to send a human into space.
Russian scientists claim that these dogs have blazed the trail for cosmic flight by man. Having whizzed round the Earth 17 times, we're told, at a height of 200 miles, they were safely back with quite a story to tell, if only they could tell it.
The Soviets had a group of 20 potential candidates for the task. One of those men was Yuri Gagarin. He was preparing for an unprecedented and incredibly dangerous challenge.
The earliest astronauts were well aware that they were sitting in a little tiny capsule on top of fundamentally a converted intercontinental ballistic missile. I mean, these are the same rockets that were poised to set off a nuclear war.
Then, on the 12th of April 1961, Gagarin was strapped into the cramped space capsule on the top of a ballistic missile, ready for launch.
Was it hazardous? Yes, it was. But he was prepared for the task.
There was no countdown, just a series of commands from the control room, and Gagarin's rocket was propelled up into the sky. He would ultimately orbit the Earth for a total of 108 minutes. In that time, Gagarin became the first human to see the sun rise over the Earth.
The space programs of the United States and the Soviet Union was one of intense competition for the hearts and minds of the rest of the world. When the Soviet Union was the first to launch any space vehicle with Sputnik in 1957, and then followed that just a few years later with Yuri Gagarin as the very first human being in space, it was a staggering blow to the pride of the United States.
When Gagarin returned to Earth, he became an instant celebrity. Sent on a global victory tour where he was celebrated in the press and on the streets.
The man drawing the crowds in Cyprus is Yuri Gagarin, spaceman #1, no less. Having had a good look at the Earth from space, he's now having a good time orbiting all over its surface.
Yuri Gagarin was 27 years old when he took that fateful mission into space. It has been speculated that he was chosen not only for his skill and talent in training, but also his working-class background. Origins that suited the idea that under communism, people from humble beginnings could succeed. But in the intervening years, the politics fall further to the background, leaving only Gagarin's remarkable act.
And I think what's happened is that with the perspective now of many, many years past the Cold War, individuals have said, well, what Yuri Gagarin did was something that humanity accomplished. So I think the image that we in the West have of him has changed from being a representative or tool of the Soviet Empire or the communist state to a human being that accomplished something extraordinary, being the first ever human in space.
A political and military leader, his vision was steeped in ideological thinking. An ideology he would use to lead the largest population in the world in a revolution that would fundamentally transform their country. Mao Zedong became a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921.
A man of the soil, he believes that the ultimate power in China belongs to the peasants. who make up 80% of the nation's population.
For decades, he would fight for his vision of an uprising led by the people, building a reputation as a preeminent strategist against both the Chinese Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and invading Japanese forces during World War II.
Mao was a man of action. Some would see him as a philosopher. I see him primarily as a political leader and one who brought about an extraordinary achievement after a century of disunity in one of the oldest continuing civilizations on the planet.
In the aftermath of the Second World War, Mao established a philosophy that adapted Marxism to the actual historical conditions of China, now known as Mao Zedong thought. The influence of his ideology was reinforced through a powerful cult of personality. But Mao still had to win control of the country. Between 1946 and 1949, a bloody civil war was waged between the nationalists and the communists.
The military situation from the nationalist point of view is very grave. They claim that the communists are kept supplied by the USSR, saying that the Chinese Reds were armed with modern military equipment from Russia.
Mao's Red Army would eventually prevail, and October 1st, 1949, Mao declared the People's Republic of China, launching a campaign to not only rebuild, but to transform and strengthen the country. Mao pushed for a level of industrial development and collective farming that would prove unmanageable. The great leap forward that Mao envisaged led to a large step backward economically. 3 years of harsh conditions would cause the deaths of millions of people. In response, Mao declared war on members of his own party, blaming them for the country's problems, calling on the nation's youth to rise up and call them to account. What followed would be known as the Cultural Revolution. Millions of students and other supporters donned red armbands and acted on Mao's orders. For 3 years, their campaign tore the country apart. Despite calls for Mao to use military force to quell the uprising, it would continue until his death in 1976.
Well, Mao has an extraordinary list of positive and negative achievements. On the positive side, he united this country. On the negative side, Mao brought about the Great Leap Forward, which saw the mass death of a lot of civilians through poor economic policies and a failure to respond to the circumstances of famine. And he brought about the Cultural Revolution. So Mao's record will always be a mixed one.
Despite his troubled legacy, Mao Zedong's influence on China was immense. His revolution may have been fraught, but he ultimately helped position his country for a new century as a superpower in the making. Computing technology was born in the post-World War II science boom, but in the early years, it was inaccessible to average consumers who couldn't see what role it could play in their lives, until two men would create a product that defined personal computing. In April 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded their company, Apple Computer. Their plan was to fill a gap in the market by building a user-friendly computer for everyday consumers.
Steve Wozniak was the technical guy and brilliant at creating circuit boards with very few components. At the time, personal computers in mid-70s were really underpowered. I mean, they were just barely capable of functioning. Being able to get the most out of them was tremendously important. And he became the engineering part of the company. Jobs was always kind of entrepreneurial and also very strong sense of aesthetics.
Working mostly out of Jobs' bedroom and garage, they built the Apple I, followed a year later by the Apple II, a device that would become an icon of the personal computing revolution. The Apple II was unlike any of its competitors. Capable of color graphics and sound without any add-ons, but with room to add modems, printers, and disk drives, as well as beefing up its internal memory. But the success of the Apple II wasn't just about what Wozniak had designed it to do. It was also the approach to marketing the product, tapping into a huge market by helping people visualize why they needed a computer in their home.
Together, they shaped our expectations of what a personal computer is and popularized the idea that you might want one.
The next great leap Apple computer would make was the Macintosh.
Communication, of course, is more powerful a weapon than any fleet. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh.
The release of the Macintosh in 1984 brought a whole bunch of features to the personal computer people hadn't seen, the mouse, the graphical user interface. I would say it also did something quite different that every successful product seems to need, which is to make the computer cool or fashionable.
Many of us have been working on Macintosh for over 2 years now, and it has turned out insanely great.
What Wozniak and Steve Jobs had created together was critical to the rise of personal computing. Together, they made computers smaller, more intuitive, and accessible. Their Apple II is credited with readying the world for future technologies like the Macintosh, and into the new century with the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad, positioning computers as an essential part of our everyday lives. For most of human history, bacteria was our most dangerous enemy, a killer that could turn a paper cut into a death sentence. That we have prevailed over this scourge is owed to a scientist who turned a fateful discovery into one of the most significant leaps in medical science. Howard Flory, with lab partner Ernst Chain and a team of scientists, began investigating natural antibiotics in 1938, work that had started a decade earlier with another scientist, Alexander Fleming. He had discovered that mold growing on a sample of bacteria, Staphylococcus, in his lab had destroyed the surrounding bacteria. The active substance in the mold would be known as penicillin.
He tried to develop it as a topical antibiotic for people who had wounds, especially war wounds. However, after a few short years of trying to purify it, he gave up, and it became forgotten for most of the 1930s.
Where Fleming had failed, Flory and his team were determined to succeed. They set out in 1939 to isolate and extract penicillin in quantities high enough to be used as treatment for bacterial infections.
Flory and his team, working first in the laboratory with mice and other animals, worked on refining the growth of the penicillin mold and then extracting the chemical. In 4 short years, they reached a point where they could do some trials in humans. Very, very impressive work.
In Britain during the Second World War, there were inadequate resources to produce Flory's new antibiotic in large quantities. So Flory and one of his scientists took the risk to fly across the Atlantic in a blacked-out plane, seeking backers for the drug amongst US drug companies.
It became very clear early on that this drug was effective and it was safe. It could be used to treat very serious infections of the skin, of the blood, of the brain. And these infections responded quickly to the antibacterial activity of penicillin.
By late 1943, penicillin was being mass-produced and put to use to treat soldiers wounded in the war. Australia, Flory's country of birth, was the first to make the antibiotic available for civilian use. Other countries soon followed. Penicillin was the first in a new era of medical science, antibiotics. They are now an accepted part of our everyday lives, treating everything from a child's ear infection to a serious infection of the blood. Made possible by Howard Flory.
Co-discoverers of the miracle drug penicillin share their $30,000 prize. Dr. Alexander Fleming of Britain, Dr. Ernst Chain of Germany, and Dr. Howard Flory of Australia.
One of the most important movements of the 20th century was the fight for civil rights in America, a struggle to end the suffering of generations of African Americans living under systemic oppression, discrimination, and marginalization. One man's ability to inspire and unite would make him a shining light in the battle for equality seen around the world.
The main thing I want to say to you is fear not. That's right. We've gone too far to turn back. That's right. Let us be calm. We are together. We are not afraid. Amen. And we shall overcome. That's right.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a PhD graduate from Boston University and pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama.
Giving in for what we are standing for.
By the mid-1950s, he had turned to leading non-violent protests against the injustice of racial segregation. Acts of civil disobedience, from bus boycotts and sit-ins at white-only lunch counters to demonstrations in the streets. He was a charismatic face of the movement and a skilled orator.
As we move in dark and desolate jail cells, we will still cry freedom. Standing amid the sweltering ruins of our 16th Street Baptist Church, we will still cry freedom.
On August 28, 1963, King led over 200,000 people in the March on Washington, calling for change through peaceful action. King's speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial would become an enduring moment in the civil rights movement.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
It was designed to tap into that tradition in black oratory of pointing out the hypocrisy of the nation. But I think what made the speech really special was that he linked that, and he had the insight to know that saying that America is hypocritical is important, but it's not enough. You needed to express a vision for what might happen if we did live up to those ideals, and kind of give that dream, that vision, substance by describing an America beyond race.
The March on Washington brought an unprecedented level of national attention to the issue of racial inequality and discrimination. A year later, the Civil Rights Act 1964 was passed, giving federal government the power to enforce desegregation in public places and outlawing discrimination on the basis of race, religion, gender, or nation of origin. King had turned his attention to campaigns against poverty and the Vietnam War when he was assassinated on a hotel balcony in Memphis on April 4, 1968. Grief and shock over their sudden loss turned to riots and demonstrations in over 100 cities across the nation. Martin Luther King Jr. remains a symbol of a tumultuous period of change that forever altered race relations in America.
I think he's one of the great symbols for social justice, for equal rights, for nonviolence. He's probably the greatest symbol for the struggle for citizenship rights, even though his vision went beyond that. And I think he symbolizes one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century. The notion that everyone living in an area, in a nation, deserves equal treatment under the law.
And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
He was both an inventor and an entrepreneur, creating technologies that remain cornerstones of modern society, pioneering a new model for developing and monetizing inventions. Thomas Edison had been working for years as an independent inventor and entrepreneur when he made the decision to open his own laboratory. In 1876, Edison began operating out of a 2.5-story building his father built for him in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Edison's time at Menlo Park would prove to be the most important and prolific period of his life. The difference was that he was no longer merely an inventor. At Menlo Park, Edison was running a new research and development lab, where other inventors would work to solve Edison's ideas and problems until he had a viable product to patent.
Edison was a serial patenter. He had over 1,000 patents to his name. What Edison would do is pretty much patent everything he could think of, even if he hadn't invented the outcome yet. And then he had some recourse to go back if something was invented later and someone had solved a problem, say, oh, I thought of that. And he may have thought of it, but he hadn't completed it.
In the years between his first invention and his last, Thomas Edison averages a patent every other week.
Among Edison's most important patents and the most influential work to emerge out of Menlo Park was his direct current electricity. DC electricity may have eventually lost to Tesla and Westinghouse's alternating current technology, but it was an important stepping stone, one of the first sparks in the electrical age. With each newly patented technology, Edison's reputation as the world's greatest inventor grew. A reputation that persists over 100 years after he opened his first research laboratory.
To those who attribute his greatness to some mystical genius, Edison has a quick reply. Genius, he says, is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration.
I think historically now when we look back with a little bit more nuance. He was a great man, he was a great thinker and a great inventor, but often what he did was take these ideas, put them together, and turn them into a commercializable form.
Thomas Edison is most commonly remembered as an inventor, known for his role in the development of electricity, of the light bulb, his work in telephone technology, his early forays in moving pictures, and the voice recording phonograph, among many others. But his role in developing the research laboratory model has also been hugely influential.
In many ways, we can attribute the invention of the modern research and development laboratory to Edison, with multiple teams working at the same time on collaborative projects, multiple projects at the same time. And this allowed him to really put into practice a kind of industrialization of the invention process. I think that's really crucial. I mean, it's really difficult to overemphasize just how important that model was in terms of creating technological innovation on an industrial scale.
In the late 1800s, women around the world began to fight in earnest for their right to vote and to stand for election. Women's suffrage was one of the great social movements of modern history, leading to a struggle that would last for decades, with progress beginning in the most unlikely of places. Vida Goldstein's childhood in Melbourne, Australia, often involved helping her mother campaign for women's suffrage. She knew from an early age that she wanted to dedicate her life to improving the lives of women. Her work would make her part of an international movement.
The suffragette movement was afoot. Militant ladies were willing to go to jail, picket the House of Commons, chain themselves to railings in order to secure the vote.
Women weren't excluded from the franchise because of their status or their class or their property. They were excluded solely because of their sex. And that brought a real focus on womanhood suffrage, on what women had to struggle long and hard to win political rights.
Women were no longer willing to accept their disenfranchisement and would at times resort to extremes to make their point, going on hunger strikes and even dying for their cause.
Emily Davison was killed when she threw herself under the King's horse in the Derby of 1913.
The actions of British suffragettes like Emmeline Pankhurst and Emily Davison are well remembered by history. Yet some of the earliest developments in the movement to gain the vote for women would happen in Australia.
Vida Goldstein was associated with arguably a world historic turning point because she led the suffrage movement in Australia, and Australian women were the first in the world ever to win full political rights. That is, the right to vote and the right to stand for the National Parliament. And this happened in 1902. For not only centuries before this, but millennia before this, women simply didn't participate on an equal basis in politics.
Goldstein was hailed around the world for the tremendous achievements she had helped bring about.
She went in 1902 to the first international women's suffrage conference held in Washington, and she was the delegate for Australasia. And she was welcomed there as a harbinger of progress, a harbinger of this new advanced democratic nation in the New World from across the Pacific.
What this celebration of Australia's progressive stance overlooked was the continued disenfranchisement of Indigenous Australians. They would not win the right to vote for decades. While the struggle for equal voting rights was far from over, Goldstein pioneered a huge leap forward for the movement. Her story intertwines with those of women around the world who strove to secure their rightful place in the political discourse of nations.
Muss in Deutschland kommen und muss sagen, den Frieden wollen wir, aber diese ununterbrochene Drückung lehnen wir ab. Bei Diktaten wirken wir nicht mit.
In 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles, effectively ending the First World War and forcing them to pay massive reparations to the Allied powers. The debt Germany owed America was substantial, and when the American stock market crashed in 1929, they called it in. The German economy all but collapsed. Unemployment rose to 6 million people, and bitterness towards the government grew. The Treaty of Versailles was blamed for the country's problems. People turned to the Nazi Party and its leader, Adolf Hitler, for answers.
There was so much chaos, confusion, and doubt in people's minds. He became a much more important presence than, if you like, his small portion of the votes justified. But by this total single-mindedness, by the total ruthlessness of his approach, he was able to outmaneuver the more conventional parties. And this is how he arrived in power in January 1933.
By August 1934, Hitler had consolidated his role as Chancellor and his newly elected position as President into one new role, Führer, or leader. He began refashioning the country into a highly militaristic fascist state, preparing the country for war.
Nazism has held its great convention. Masses of uniformed men, stupefying to the eye and incredible to the imagination, have stood in spellbound audience of the Führer.
Hitler combined the potential of mass media with compelling rhetoric to demonize minorities such as the Jewish population for the problems Germany faced.
He would start off very quietly so that people were sort of basically leaning forward, and then he would start to speak, and it was rather musical in the sense that he would always start bringing things gradually to a crescendo, and many would come out afterwards totally convinced by what he'd said, but they had no idea what he'd really said. So it was a rather terrifying example of the exploitation of modern methods of communication.
Hitler also began sowing the seeds for what he called racial hygiene, targeting Jewish people, children and adults with disabilities, and other minority groups. First marginalized and demonized, ultimately sent to concentration camps or murdered in state-sanctioned euthanasia programs. In 1939, Hitler shocked the world by invading Poland, precipitating the Second World War. Only when Nazi Germany fell to the Allies in 1945 were the true extent of their murderous policies revealed. It is estimated that the Nazis and their collaborators were responsible for 11 to 14 million deaths, 6 million of whom were Jewish. Hitler's hubris drew the world into 6 years of turmoil that destroyed millions of lives, altered borders, ideologies, and international relationships.
If it hadn't been for Hitler and the Second World War, obviously we wouldn't have seen the Cold War. By triggering the Second World War, he, in fact, brought global history together. The Japanese would never have attacked the Americans if they didn't think that the British and the Americans would have been tied down in Europe eventually. So that accelerated the globalization of history in a way.
The ripples of Hitler's actions have been felt across the world. The mass exodus of refugees from Germany and Nazi-controlled territories was a large-scale displacement of people never seen on that scale again in the 20th century. The horrors of his policies are almost impossible to conceive if the evidence weren't there to prove it happened. Revealing so viscerally how one man can capitalize on a nation's desperation and uncertainty, stoking fear and suspicion, and thus change the course of history. A century in which the impossible dream of human flight became reality. Two brothers whose invention would shrink the vastness of our world and open up the skies to exploration and discovery. From a young age, brothers Wilbur and Orville Wright were fascinated by the problem of a human being able to fly. They spent years developing a series of unpowered planes.
What the Wright brothers did, which is the reason why they're attributed to inventing flight, is that they introduced a control system which is still used today. It's a 3-axis control system where you control the plane with pitch, yaw and roll. And that was fundamental because that enabled them to have sustained and repeatable flight.
The Wright brothers first succeeded in flying a plane that was power-driven and heavier than air in December 1903.
The toss of a coin in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, won Orville Wright the chance to be the first man in history to fly under power.
Their plane was only in the air for 59 seconds, but it was a miraculous moment in aviation history. One that many didn't believe had ever happened.
A big part of the Wright brothers' work subsequently after they invented flight was, first of all, proving it. It took them 4 or 5 years of road trips around the world, proving to people they could fly. They then had a huge amount of work to protect their patent because everyone just started copying it.
The Wright brothers shared credit for their invention, but Orville was the engineer and Wilbur the savvy businessman. An unstoppable combination. In the years after their first flight, the Wright brothers would sell their airplanes around the world.
Encouraged by President Teddy Roosevelt, the War Department opened bids for a heavier-than-air flying machine.
By 1908, they had their first U.S. Army contract. Only 4 years later, Wilbur died of typhoid fever. In his short life, he made an immense contribution to one of the most important developments in human history. Orville would continue to work in aviation engineering, going on to become one of the most celebrated Americans of the 20th century.
If you look at where aviation's come from since the Wright brothers first had their controlled flight, it's influenced every piece of major aircraft design. When you fly in a 747 today, that only flies because of what the Wright brothers found over 100 years ago.
The feat that Orville and Wilbur Wright achieved is echoed through the 20th century and beyond. They were pioneers who unlocked the potential for space exploration and possibilities we've yet to fully realize. Today, the Wright brothers' 1903 aircraft sits on display at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Its label reads, "By original scientific research, the Wright brothers discovered the principles of human flight. As inventors, builders, and flyers, they further developed the aeroplane, taught man to fly, and opened the era of aviation."